Prince Harry are sharing a peek at life in California with little Archie.
You know, we hear the word bombshell, and I think certainly it's true in this case.
They're setting up in California to spread wellness and love and sincerity, have done the exact opposite. They have dumped on their family, dumped on Britain.
Harry didn't respond the way someone does when they hear a rumor they know is false. There was no casual dismissal, no quiet confidence, no waiting it out until the noise passed. Instead, everything moved fast. Too fast. Legal warnings were drafted within hours. Messages were relayed through intermediaries. Journalists were pressured. Advisors scrambled. The reaction wasn't measured. It was urgent, emotional, almost frantic. And for people who've watched Prince Harry weather years of controversy, that alone raised eyebrows. Because this wasn't his first scandal. Far from it. Harry had endured relentless press storms before, many louder and uglier than this. Yet those were brushed aside, reframed, or ignored. This one wasn't. This one landed differently. It hit something deeper than reputation or public opinion. It triggered a response that felt personal, visceral. That's where Tom Bower comes in. Bower isn't known for impulsive claims or reckless timing. He waits, he watches, he gathers. And when he finally speaks, it's rarely to provoke noise. It's to provoke reaction, not outrage exposure. The kind that forces people to move before they're ready. And that's the real mystery here. Not what was hinted, not what was implied, but why this specific allegation caused such immediate panic. Why it couldn't be laughed off, why it couldn't be starved of oxygen like everything else. Because whatever Tom Bower was threatening wasn't just another headline. And the reason lies in what he was actually putting at risk. What makes Tom Bower dangerous to powerful people isn't his tone or his language. It's his patience. Bower doesn't chase headlines, and he doesn't lob accusations into the open and hope they stick. He studies patterns, waits out denials, and lets time do most of the work for him. When he finally speaks, it's usually after everyone involved has convinced themselves the risk has passed. That's why his timing matters. Years can go by with silence, and then suddenly, one carefully placed sentence appears, not as a rant, not as a leak, but as a signal. Bower's releases are never floods. They're pressure points. Each detail is chosen not to prove everything, but to force a reaction that proves something on its own. There's also a crucial difference between rumor and implication, backed by structure. Gossip relies on repetition. Bower relies on alignment documents that match timelines, witnesses that reinforce records, and gaps that refuse to close cleanly. He rarely says more than necessary because he doesn't need to. The response does the talking for him. That's why this wasn't a media circus spiraling out of control. There were no chaotic leaks, no anonymous pile-ons, no tabloid free-for-all. What unfolded felt deliberate, measured, almost surgical. Each move seemed designed to draw out anxiety rather than attention. And the most unsettling part for those on the receiving end is this: Bower doesn't release information unless he's already seen how people behave when they feel cornered. The reaction is the reveal. But this time, he wasn't just poking at reputation. There's a clear line between scandal and threat, and this was the moment it got crossed. Until now, everything surrounding the Sussex story had lived in familiar territory: image, behavior, credibility, reputation. Messy, yes. Damaging often, but survivable. What entered the conversation this time wasn't about optics at all. It was about blood. Questioning the origins of a royal child isn't tabloid sport. It's existential. It reaches into titles, inheritance, lineage, the architecture that holds the monarchy together. These aren't emotional concepts. They're structural ones. And once that structure is questioned, even hypothetically, the consequences ripple far beyond public opinion. It's no longer about defending a narrative. It's about protecting certainty. That's why the reaction from Prince Harry mattered so much. He didn't move like someone consulting a long-term strategy. He moved like someone blindsided. The response was raw, immediate, and personal anger before calculation, demands before planning. That distinction didn't go unnoticed. People who are confident in the truth tend to slow things down. They let claims collapse under their own weight. They don't rush the barricades. This time, there was no pause, no calm reassurance. Just visible strain and a sense of urgency that felt disproportionate to the words actually spoken. And that imbalance is what unsettled observers most. Because when the response outweighs the accusation, it invites scrutiny all on its own. It wasn't the allegation that did the damage. It was the spiral, the sense that something fundamental had been touched, something that couldn't be shrugged off or reframed. And that spiral raised one uncomfortable question. There was a moment when everything could have stopped. Not slowed down, not debated, ended. Cleanly and permanently. That's what made the silence so loud. This is what some observers began calling the verification paradox, the idea that when a simple act can erase doubt, refusing to take it only multiplies suspicion. In situations like this, clarity is usually the shield. One decisive move, one unambiguous confirmation, and the entire narrative collapses under its own weight. That option was always there, and yet it never appeared. Instead, the public saw deflection, then frustration, then anger. Each response felt increasingly emotional, increasingly reactive, and increasingly out of step with how airtight false claims are normally handled. What's important here isn't legal nuance or technical explanation. It's audience logic. Viewers don't think like lawyers or palace advisors. They think in patterns. When accusations are false, people expect calm. When certainty exists, they expect confidence. Silence, on the other hand, creates space, and space invites imagination. The absence of proof didn't function as a defense. It became fuel. Every unanswered question turned into a blank the audience felt compelled to fill. Every delay encouraged new theories, new timelines, new interpretations. Even neutral observers began to ask why something so easy to resolve was being treated like a third rail. At that point, the story no longer belonged to the people inside it. It belonged to the crowd watching from the outside, connecting dots that may or may not have mattered, but suddenly felt relevant because no one shut the door. And once the internet sensed hesitation, it went to work. Once hesitation became visible, the story slipped out of official hands. Statements stopped mattering. Silence became interpreted, and the crowd stepped in. This is the moment when online investigation replaced the approved narrative, not because people believed they had proof, but because they sensed gaps. Old travel dates resurfaced. Timelines that once felt incidental were re-examined with fresh eyes. Photos were compared. Appearances were scrutinized. Public schedules were laid over private movements. Individually, none of it meant much. That point matters. No single screenshot date or anomaly proved anything on its own, and most people acknowledged that openly. But stories don't gain traction through isolated facts. They gain momentum through coherence. When details begin to line up in ways that feel deliberate, belief starts to form even without confirmation. It's pattern recognition, not evidence gathering. And once patterns emerge, they're incredibly difficult to unsee. What accelerated everything was how fast belief traveled. Facts require time. Belief doesn't. Belief spreads through instinct, through that uneasy sense that something doesn't fully add up. It moves faster than corrections and survives longer than clarifications. By the time official voices respond, belief has already hardened into assumption. That's why the internet didn't treat this like a mystery to solve. It treated it like a puzzle that had already decided what the picture looked like. Each new silence, each delayed response, each emotional reaction was absorbed into the pattern rather than correcting it. At that point, the damage wasn't being done by rumors. It was being done by the absence of interruption. The longer nothing shut it down, the more real it felt to the audience watching it unfold. But speculation alone isn't what shifted the story. Speculation can be dismissed. Patterns can be argued, but tone changes when a witness steps forward, especially one with nothing obvious to gain. That's why the introduction of Trevor Engelson altered the atmosphere almost instantly. Former partners occupy a strange space in public narratives. They're close enough to know private realities, but distant enough to be written off as biased. That tension gives their words weight when they speak carefully. And Trevor did. He hadn't chased interviews. He hadn't hinted online. He hadn't tried to correct the story for years. His silence had stretched so long that most people assumed he would never speak at all, which is exactly why the timing mattered. When someone stays quiet through fame, reinvention, and global attention, then finally agrees to go on record, audiences don't hear bitterness first. They listen for restraint. And that restraint was there. His delivery wasn't angry or theatrical. It was flat, measured, almost exhausted. The kind of tone that suggests someone reliving something they'd rather leave buried. What detonated discussion wasn't a dramatic accusation. It was a single phrase that slipped through calmly and lingered. She reframed it. Not denied, not explained, reframed. That word hit harder than any allegation could have. Because reframing implies strategy, not panic. Control, not confusion. Comment sections fixated on it immediately. Analysts replayed it. Viewers paused and rewound. The phrase suggested a mindset rather than an incident, a way of handling truth that felt calculated instead of emotional. And from that moment, the story stopped being external. Public narratives are managed. Private doubt isn't. Once questions move behind closed doors, the tone changes completely. This is where the story stopped being about headlines and started being about conversations that don't have scripts. According to this account, doubt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through small moments, hesitations, inconsistencies, questions that lingered a second too long before being answered. Inside a marriage, questions shift power. The person asking them gains leverage not because they're right, but because curiosity disrupts control. What had once been a united front began to feel uneven. Curiosity met resistance, calm questions met emotional reactions, and those reactions mattered more than the questions themselves. What observers found striking wasn't public defiance, but private unraveling. This wasn't a man worried about press coverage or brand damage. It was someone grappling with identity. Prince Harry had already severed ties with his past, his institution, and much of his family to protect the life he believed he was building. When doubt touched that foundation, it didn't threaten an image. It threatened meaning. Accounts described tension replacing ease, conversation shortening, eye contact breaking first. Questions once brushed aside suddenly landing heavier, and the more clarity was resisted, the louder the uncertainty became. Emotional reactions replaced strategic ones. Anger surfaced where reassurance should have been. At that point, the fracture wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Doubt has a way of isolating people even when they're not alone. And once identity becomes entangled with uncertainty, there's no public statement that can repair it. Outside the house, the silence was doing even more damage. Institutions survive uncertainty. Not truth as a philosophical idea, but certainty as a structure, clear records, clean timelines, established precedent. That's why unresolved questions make institutions nervous in a way scandals never do. Scandals can be managed, outlasted, or reframed. Uncertainty just sits there, quietly corroding trust. Historically, royal matters follow rigid patterns. Announcements are formal. Documentation is precise. Medical confirmations are standardized. When deviations appear, they usually come with explanations designed to close the loop quickly. That's not an accusation, it's precedent. And precedent exists for a reason to prevent speculation from filling gaps. What unsettled observers in this case were the delays and the missing pieces. Not dramatic absences, but subtle ones. Vague confirmations where specifics were expected. Unusual sequencing. Carefully managed appearances that answered just enough questions to move forward, but not enough to end discussion. Each deviation on its own was defensible. Together, they felt incomplete. That's when institutions often choose silence. Silence can be strategic. It avoids amplifying fringe theories and denies oxygen to speculation. But silence only works when the public believes clarity exists somewhere behind the scenes. When people start to doubt that clarity exists at all, silence backfires. Because belief doesn't need official validation. Once belief takes hold, it spreads independently, feeding on emotion and repetition rather than fact. And belief is far harder to stop than scandal. Scandal burns hot and fades. Belief settles in and stays. By this point, the question had already evolved. At a certain point, the question quietly shifted. It stopped being, "Is this true?" and became something far more corrosive. Why hasn't this been ended? That change mattered. Proof lives in courts and documents. Perception lives in people's minds. And once perception takes over, facts are no longer driving the conversation, reactions are. By now, the public wasn't watching for new evidence. They were watching for clarity. Not noise, not outrage, not threats. Clarity. And what they saw instead was the opposite. More statements, more denials, more frustration. Each response added volume, but not resolution. Noise filled the space where certainty should have been. What made this phase especially dangerous was the restraint on the other side. Tom Bauer never crossed the line into accusation. He didn't declare conclusions or name outcomes. He did something far more effective. He stopped talking. He allowed the unanswered questions to linger untouched, letting the silence do the work for him. That restraint mattered. Accusations invite rebuttal. Silence invites interpretation. And interpretation spreads. Bauer's approach shifted responsibility without ever claiming it. If nothing was wrong, clarity would arrive. If clarity didn't arrive, the audience drew its own conclusions. He didn't need to indict anyone. The absence of closure began to feel like an indictment on its own. By this stage, even skeptics weren't arguing facts anymore. They were arguing plausibility, and plausibility thrives in unresolved space. Once a story reaches that point, it becomes self-sustaining, fueled less by what's said than by what isn't, and that leads to the most dangerous part of all. In the end, this story never became about proof. Proof is clean. Proof closes doors. What unsettled people wasn't the existence of a claim, but the absence of certainty where certainty should have been easy to restore. The longer that certainty failed to appear, the less the details mattered. Doubt had already done its work. That's the part many narratives miss. Once doubt enters a story, this personal, this foundational, it doesn't wait for confirmation. It reshapes everything around it. Even if answers arrive later, they arrive too late to undo the damage already done. Trust doesn't snap back into place once it fractures. It erodes quietly, then all at once. There's a tragic irony at the center of it all. A rebellion built on escaping control. A sacrifice made in the name of truth and freedom. A life reconstructed around the promise of certainty and loyalty. And yet the one question that could anchor everything was never fully put to rest. Not publicly, not clearly, not conclusively. That's why this story refuses to close. Not because people crave scandal, but because unresolved questions have gravity. They pull attention back again and again, demanding resolution that never quite comes. Silence doesn't calm them. Time doesn't erase them. So the conversation lingers, not as an accusation, but as an echo. If the truth is simple, why has it taken this long to show it?